Hello to you, the learner. If you are tuning in today, well, I know exactly why you're here.
You're probably the kind of person who just lives for those sudden aha moments.
Exactly. You like to understand how things work under the hood. You, uh, you genuinely enjoy discovering the hidden architects behind the culture you already know and love.
Which means you are in the perfect place.
You really are. Because today's deep dive is custom tailored just for you. We are going to bypass all those famous faces posing on the album covers.
Right, we're skipping the front cover entirely.
Yeah, we're going straight to the fine print and the liner notes. Our mission today is to explore the life, the 4-decade career, and the undeniable groove of a man known as Master Henry Gibson.
And we're working from a really comprehensive encyclopedia entry today. It covers his life from 1942 all the way to 2002.
It's a massive discography to dig through.
It really is, and it's a fascinating journey to take, mostly because, well, it's so incredibly easy to take rhythm for granted when you're listening to music.
Oh, for sure. You're usually tapping your foot, but you're not actively thinking about it.
Right. We instinctively focus on the lead vocalist belting out a chorus, or, we wait for that screaming electric guitar solo.
But the percussionist is just kind of in the background.
Exactly. But they're the ones actually building the floor that you're dancing on. And looking through our sources today, you start to realize that Henry Gibson wasn't just building the floor.
He was the whole house.
For a massive chunk of American soul, jazz, and funk, he was the entire foundation.
I just love digging into the history of music like this. You find this one person operating mostly out of the spotlight, who somehow serves as the connective tissue between totally different eras and styles.
Yeah, he really bridged a lot of gaps.
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand how he became this backbone of American music, we really have to start in a beginning in Chicago.
Right. And the image we get of young Henry Gibson is actually pretty relatable.
He's a kid in school, and he just cannot sit still.
Yes, he's constantly tapping out rhythms on his desk.
Which is a pretty universal experience. You either did that yourself, or you sat next to the kid who drove the teacher completely crazy doing it.
Probably drove everyone crazy. But for Gibson, it wasn't just nervous energy. It was the early manifestation of a lifelong calling.
So he takes that energy and channels it early on.
Yeah, by the time he was 10 years old, he had gotten his hands on a set of bongos.
10 years old.
Yep. But he didn't just practice quietly in his bedroom. He took them straight out into his neighborhood. He was performing on the street corners and, get this, even setting up inside local laundromats to play.
Wait, playing bongos inside a working laundromat?
Yeah, right in the middle of people doing their laundry.
Wasn't he just driving people up the wall while they were trying to do their wash?
You'd think so, but think about the acoustics of a 1950s laundromat.
Oh, I guess you have all those hard tile floors.
Tile floors, spinning metal machines. It creates this incredible echo chamber. Plus, you have a captive audience of people just sitting around waiting for their clothes to dry.
That is actually a brilliant, if unconventional, place for a 10-year-old to figure out how to capture an audience's attention.
Entirely self-taught, too. He was just finding a stage wherever he could.
And that grassroots, street-level hustle is exactly what makes his leap into the professional world so impressive.
It's a huge jump.
He goes from the corner laundromat to becoming one of the most sought-after session musicians in the incredibly competitive 1960s Chicago studio scene.
Right, and that scene was no joke.
So what did that actually look like? Because being a session musician sounds like a steady, normal job, but my understanding is that it's an absolute pressure cooker.
What's fascinating here is the sheer versatility that environment demanded. Being a session musician in Chicago in the 60s meant you could not be a one-trick pony.
You had to be a chameleon.
You were essentially a hired gun. You'd walk into a recording studio on a Tuesday morning, often having never even heard the song you were about to play.
And they expect perfection.
Exactly. You were expected to lay down a flawless, iconic track right on the spot. Time was money in those studios.
And looking at the roster of legends he was suddenly recording with during this period, it's immense. You've got jazz icons like Stan Getz and Oscar Peterson.
Huge names.
But then he wasn't just staying in the jazz lane. He was crossing over into these massive R&B and soul sessions, too.
Yeah, he was everywhere.
The records show he recorded with Jackie Wilson, the powerhouse vocal group The Impressions, and even Aretha Franklin.
Aretha Franklin.
I have to ask, how does a percussionist even adjust their playing style from a smooth, cool jazz session with Stan Getz one day to a booming, gospel-infused soul track with Aretha Franklin the next?
Well, that adaptability is exactly what earned him the nickname Master. He had this innate, almost sixth sense understanding of what a song needed.
Like an intuition.
Precisely. If it was a cool jazz track, he knew how to lay back and just texture the soundscape without overpowering the brass.
And if it was Aretha?
He knew exactly how to push the tempo and drive the energy upward.
But we also shouldn't confine Gibson just to the walls of the recording studios, right? Because he was deeply embedded in the social and cultural heartbeat of 1960s Chicago.
Very much so. For example, he regularly performed at events for Reverend Jesse Jackson's Operation Push.
Which was a major force for civil rights and economic justice at the time.
Absolutely.
And I want to point out, regardless of where anyone stood politically, his rhythms were quite literally providing the soundtrack to the major social movements of the era.
That's a great way to put it. He was woven into the fabric of the city. He also became a key member of Phil Corrin's Artistic Heritage Ensemble.
Oh, wow.
And he played with the jazz group Odell Brown and the Organizers. He was a cornerstone of a very specific, culturally rich, and highly innovative black arts scene in Chicago.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because as we move from the late 1960s into the 1970s, we see Gibson evolve.
He steps up.
He stops just being a guy who plays on the tracks,
Mm-hmm.
and his sound actually becomes the reason the tracks work at all.
He transitions from a brilliant session player into a defining sonic force.
And that brings us to his pivotal collaborations, starting with Donny Hathaway.
Yes. Donny Hathaway's 1970 album, Everything is Everything. It's widely considered a masterpiece of soul music, and Gibson was right there in the mix.
Right in the thick of it.
Our sources specifically highlight his percussion work on Hathaway's breakthrough single, The Ghetto.
The Ghetto is such a legendary track. It's this sprawling, atmospheric, deeply rhythmic song, and Gibson's conga playing is the absolute heartbeat of it.
You can almost feel the bustling streets of Chicago when you listen to that groove.
You really can. But as important as his work with Hathaway was, it was his partnership with another Chicago legend that would really define his career for the next decade. Let's talk about Curtis Mayfield.
The Curtis Mayfield era is where music history really pivots.
It's a game changer.
This partnership fundamentally reshaped American soul and funk. Gibson began touring and recording extensively with Mayfield, and his distinctive style on the bongos and congas became an integral part of Mayfield's sound.
Which was incredibly cinematic, right? And socially conscious.
Cinematic is the perfect word for it. We see Gibson playing on Mayfield's landmark 1971 album Curtis Live, and then, of course, the monumental 1972 soundtrack for the film Superfly.
Superfly. And the defining track they point out is Pusherman.
Oh, yeah.
Even if you don't know the name of the song, if you hear the first 5 seconds of it, you recognize it instantly. It is driven by this slinky, irresistible percussion groove.
It just pulls you in.
But how exactly does a conga player change the whole landscape of a song like that? Why not just use a standard drum set?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the early 1970s was a period where soul music was maturing. It was becoming more orchestrated, more complex, and heavily reliant on what we call polyrhythms.
Okay, for someone who isn't a music theorist, what exactly is a polyrhythm?
Think of it this way. Imagine tapping a steady, basic 1, 2, 3, 4 beat with your foot.
Okay, tapping my foot.
That's your standard drum kit keeping the time. Now, try tapping a completely different, off-kilter, faster rhythm with your hands at the exact same time.
That sounds like rubbing your stomach and patting your head.
It's exactly like that. That layering of different contrasting rhythms over top of each other creates a polyrhythm.
So it has a ton of texture.
Yes. In the 60s, a standard drum kit kept the beat, but as soul transitioned into 70s funk, musicians needed these extra layers of rhythm to create a groove rather than just a tempo.
And that is where Gibson's congas came in.
Exactly. He filled the rhythmic gaps the drum kit couldn't reach. He wasn't just complementing the drummer, he was often acting as the lead rhythmic instrument.
So he was the engine driving the funk forward. And it wasn't just with Mayfield. You look at his work with Brunswick Records during this era, he was the backbone for major artists like the Chi-Lites and Gene Chandler.
He was everywhere. He was even appearing on screen in blaxploitation films like Superfly.
And for those unfamiliar, blaxploitation films were these 1970s movies made primarily for black audiences. They usually featured highly stylized action, gritty urban settings, and crucially, some of the best, most complex funk soundtracks ever recorded.
Absolutely. Gibson wasn't just creating the sound of that culture in a dark studio, he was visibly on screen as part of it.
But keeping up that level of output, touring, recording, filming, has to take a toll.
It would wear anyone out.
Which might explain the really surprising turn his story takes next. Right in the middle of this incredible run, shaping the sound of urban Chicago funk, Gibson completely shifts gears geographically.
He packs up.
In the mid-1970s, he moves to the island of Oahu in Hawaii.
It is a massive pivot.
It really is. I mean, why leave the absolute epicenter of funk music to go to Hawaii in the mid-70s? You're going from the gritty, hyper-competitive studio scene of cold Chicago, laying down heavy tracks like Pusherman, to the warm, breezy, laid-back environment of Waikiki Train.
Well, the best musicians are always looking to expand their palette, and Gibson didn't just retire to the beach to drink out of coconuts.
He kept working.
Oh, he immediately integrated himself into the local Hawaiian music scene, which actually had its own thriving, unique funk and soul movement happening. Our sources detail how he teamed up with a prominent local producer named Kirk Thompson to record an album called Lemuria.
Oh, the Lemuria album. If you know funk and soul record collectors, that 1978 album is considered a holy grail.
Precisely. Thompson put together what he called a super session. He gathered the absolute top tier of local Waikiki musicians, incredible vocalists and keyboard players who were shaping the island's sound.
Who was on that record?
You had Azure McCall, Tennyson Stevens, Michael Papabax Baxter, John Gillard, and Ron Felix.
Wow, just a powerhouse lineup.
And he dropped Gibson right into the middle of it. What you get on that record is Gibson taking his Chicago street corner, recording studio hustle, and perfectly blending it with the sophisticated, breezy island funk of Hawaii.
It proves that his groove wasn't just a product of Chicago, something he carried inside him.
Exactly.
And his journey keeps expanding from there. As we move into the 1980s and 1990s, the world just keeps opening up for him.
He goes global.
There's a great personal detail in the sources during this era. While he was performing at a Hard Rock cafe in Stockholm, Sweden, he met a woman named Anne, who would eventually become his wife.
That's a beautiful detail.
I just love tracking this trajectory. From Chicago laundromats in the 50s to Hawaiian Islands in the 70s to a Hard Rock cafe in Sweden in the 90s.
His global reach really demonstrates how universal the language of rhythm is. It completely transcends geography. In the 90s, you see him continuing to tour with incredibly diverse acts. He played with the legendary funk vocalist Chaka Khan.
It makes total sense for his style.
But he also toured with the Gypsy Kings.
The Gypsy Kings, that's a completely different genre altogether.
Entirely different. The Gypsy Kings are famous for a style called rumba flamenca. It's this incredibly fast, highly rhythmic acoustic guitar style from Spain and southern France.
I can imagine that demands a totally nimble, exhaustingly precise percussionist to keep the engine running.
It does. The fact that Gibson could seamlessly slide into a European flamenco group just goes to show how masterful his foundational skills were.
Which brings us to a part of this deep dive that I think is really special and probably the most human element of the whole story.
I agree.
We spent a lot of time talking about the incredible list of people he played for, but I want to focus on Henry Gibson, the man. Specifically, his personality and his quirks in his later years.
Because for decades, he was the ultimate sideman.
He's the unsung hero building the foundation for everybody else's mansion. But as he got older, he clearly grew tired of standing in the background.
It's a very understandable psychological shift. He felt he had more than paid his dues. And looking at what he contributed to music over 40 years, who could possibly argue with him?
Nobody could.
He became less and less content with just being the hired help in the shadows, and he began to actively assert himself as the main attraction. He would deliberately place his percussion setup right at the very front of the stage during shows.
I have so much respect for that. After 40 years, you want people to see whose hands are doing the work.
Exactly. Let them see the master at work.
And the way this attitude manifested during his live club performances in his later years is just incredible. He became somewhat famous for his concert demeanor, specifically how he dealt with noisy audiences.
Oh, this is fascinating.
You know how it is in a club? People are chatting, clinking cocktail glasses, basically treating the band like background music. Well, if the crowd wasn't paying attention to the groove, Gibson would get visibly upset.
He would not tolerate it.
He would literally stop playing, stare the audience down, and demand absolute silence.
Just cut the music entirely.
Yes. And then, once you could hear a pin drop in the room, he would lock back in and deliver these completely spellbinding, intricate bongo performances.
This raises an important question about the psychology of both the artist and the audience. We talked earlier about how easy it is for listeners to treat rhythm as an afterthought. You tap your foot to it, but you're looking at the singer.
Right, the percussion is just part of the atmosphere to them.
Gibson's behavior in his later years was a direct confrontational rebellion against that dynamic. Stopping a live show to yell at the audience is a massive risk.
It could ruin the whole vibe.
But by demanding silence, he was forcing the world to actively listen to the complex architecture they usually ignored. He was stepping out of the shadows and saying, no, you're missing the point. The foundation is the song. Pay attention.
It's such a powerful demand for the respect he had spent a lifetime earning. It's asserting your own worth when the industry might just view you as a liner note.
Definitely.
Sadly, the final chapter of his story takes place in his adopted home of Stockholm. He passed away there from a heart attack on December 18, 2002.
He was only 60 years old.
Which is still relatively young for a musician of his caliber.
Yes, it was a sudden loss. The sources note that he was performing right up until the very end.
He never really stopped.
No. His final concert appearance was at the Lidmar Hotel in Stockholm alongside a couple of great local musicians, Khaled Habib and Zach Keith.
And the impact he left on that European community was profound, wasn't it?
Very much so. A few months after he passed, his friends and fellow musicians organized a massive tribute concert for him at the Fasching Jazz Club in Stockholm. It was a beautiful way of celebrating the rhythms he brought to their world.
So what does this all mean? When we zoom out and look at the scope of this deep dive, we're looking at a 40-year catalog that is honestly difficult to fully wrap your head around.
We barely scratched the surface.
We didn't even have time to get into his brilliant work with the psychedelic soul group Rotary Connection, or how he provided the pulse for Minnie Riperton's later albums.
Or the multiple phenomenal records he did with Leroy Hudson in the late 70s.
It's true. If we listed everyone, from the staple singers to Natalie Cole, we'd be here for another hour. His fingerprints are simply everywhere.
They really are.
And the big takeaway for you, listening to this right now, is that the most crucial elements of the things we rely on in life, whether it's the music that moves us, the technology we use, or the organizations we work for, they often come from names we will never see on the billboard.
The invisible architects.
Master Henry Gibson proves that true mastery, whether you're in a corporate boardroom, a scientific laboratory, or sitting behind a set of congas, is about building a foundation so strong and so undeniable that the entire enterprise can safely rest upon it.
I think that's a wonderful way to synthesize his legacy. But before we wrap up today, there is one final detail from our sources that we deliberately held back.
Oh, right. The missing link.
Yes. It's a piece of his early history that completely reframes everything we've just discussed. We talked about his childhood tapping on desks in Chicago and his leap into the 1960s studio scene. But there is a gap in the timeline.
What happened before the Chicago hustle?
In the late 1950s, before he met Stan Getz, long before the Curtis Mayfield funk era, and decades before Hawaii or Sweden, a teenage Henry Gibson spent over a year touring the country with a calypso singer named Mighty Panther.
Wait, a calypso singer, as in Afro-Caribbean island music, in the 1950s?
Exactly, and calypso music relies heavily on syncopated rhythms.
Meaning what, exactly?
Syncopation is when you emphasize the offbeats. Instead of playing on the predictable 1, 2, 3, 4 counts, you play in the unexpected spaces between the numbers.
So it feels more unpredictable.
It creates a bouncy, driving momentum that makes you want to move. So, I want to leave you with this provocative thought to mull over.
Let's hear it.
How does a teenager traveling the country playing Afro-Caribbean calypso music in the 1950s quietly absorb those complex, offbeat rhythms, bring them back to the cold, industrial streets of Chicago, and use that specific rhythmic DNA to lay the groundwork for the defining sound of American soul and funk decades later?
That is wild to think about.
It makes you think about your own life. Consider how your own seemingly random early experiences, the weird detours you took, the odd jobs you worked, the obscure hobbies you picked up might actually be secretly laying the vital groundwork for your own future mastery.
What an incredible thought to end on. You really never know what rhythms you're absorbing right now that will define your masterpiece later on. Keep paying attention to the liner notes of your own life and keep diving deep.